Hello and welcome everyone to our Exchange Programme event. Today we are so pleased to be joined by Dr. Simon Steenson. Simon is a nutrition scientist and has recently co-authored a review on the scientific evidence for how we can shift towards a healthier and more sustainable diet. This is going to be a fun and interactive session. There will be some polls, the chat box will be there for general discussion, but please do use the Q&A section for any specific questions for Simon. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Simon.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. So I believe we have about an hour and a half for our session. So in the main part of this session, we'll be looking at what the sort of science suggests in terms of what a healthy diet looks like, and also looking at some emerging areas in terms of diet, nutrition, and health as well, in relation to things such as mental health, as well as immunity and COVID-19. And then we'll be looking to move on to the sort of the main part, really, which is to, as Kat mentioned, look at what we mean by a healthy and more sustainable diet, and how we can try to hopefully shift our own diets more in that direction. And so if you'll give me just one moment, I'm going to share my screen. And perhaps if Kat could just tell me if you're seeing that okay. Great, thank you. And as was mentioned just now as well, as we go through, we will have some poll questions to get your opinion on what you think on some of these different issues and areas, which will hopefully help to keep things more interactive as we go through. And also we do have one or two videos as well in there around some kind of common myths and misconceptions when it comes to diet. Okay, so just to talk a little bit briefly first, might be useful to know who we are at the British Nutrition Foundation. So if you've not heard of us before, we're a public-facing charity. We work with experts across the nutrition and food community to provide advice that's impartial and is evidence-based. And we do not lobby or endorse any products, and we don't allow political pressure to influence what we do. And you can see there what our main core values are. And this is a particularly important area for us, because as you can see at the top, it is our vision as a charity that everyone can access a healthy and sustainable diet. And so this is a really important area for us. And in terms of what we do and how we operate, well, we work with a number of different stakeholders, as I mentioned, throughout the food system, in terms of education, the media, the industry, as well as producing things as well for the general public in terms of articles and resources, etc. So you can find those on our website that you see in the top left there. We also produce training courses, which you might be interested in, on issues to do with diet, nutrition, and health, including more general as well as specific things like sport and exercise nutrition. We have media communications as part of what we do, as well as an education program, which links with a network of primary and secondary teachers throughout the UK. And we also have a nutrition bulletin journal, where we publish science as well. And so just to go over very quickly again what we're going to cover. So we'll be looking firstly at, well, what we mean by a healthy diet and the nutrition science that sits behind that, and what the different components are for trying to achieve a healthy diet. And then looking a bit more at diet and mental health, and also nutrition and immunity as specific sort of emerging areas. And then looking on to move on to what we mean by, well, a diet that is both healthy and also sustainable, and what some of the myths and misconceptions that seem to have emerged in this area are. And then lastly, looking at, well, what we can do ourselves to try and shift our diets in a direction that's likely to benefit both our own health as well as planetary health at the same time. Okay, and so I'd like to begin with the first poll, which I will put up in a moment. And I'll ask if maybe take about 30, 45 seconds or so to answer. But the question is, how well do you feel that you understand what's important when it comes to eating a healthy and balanced diet? Okay, 5 more seconds or so. It looks like everyone has voted. Okay, great. Thank you for that. So, but it looks as though we feel like in general that we do have a fairly good understanding of what we mean by, well, healthy and balanced diet as a term. Although there are quite a few people that look like they maybe are not too sure about this. I think it can be a very obviously confusing area because we hear things quite often in the media, and a lot of stories that report on nutrition or diet and health, they can often be quite contradictory. And so thank you very much for sharing that. And hopefully now, as we go through this first part, you can see whether or not what you understand matches up with what we recommend in terms of the evidence on this area. So, well, firstly, might be a little bit obvious perhaps for some, but it is important to think about, well, why do we need to focus on a healthy diet? I mean, it's not only about getting the right balance of energy and nutrients that we need for our bodies and for good health, but it also can reduce the risk of diseases such as, well, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers as well. And eating a healthy and a balanced diet is important throughout life, right from when we are, well, infants to childhood and into older age as well. And importantly, it's something that can benefit our health irrespective of age, race, or socioeconomic background. And so it's really important that we make progress in this area. It can also, of course, potentially support our mental health and well-being as well. And I'll talk about the research on this a little bit later. And overall, aiming for a healthier diet can help us to try to establish a more positive relationship with the food that we have, so we can hopefully enjoy it more, but also enjoy the health benefits as well. So what is meant by a healthy diet, and what does this look like? Well, in general, we don't eat just single foods or nutrients, but we of course eat an overall diet. And so that's where we quite often talk about dietary patterns. And this is the way that research in nutrition has gone increasingly in recent years. And there are a range of different styles or ways of eating that you may have heard about that have been quite well studied in terms of their health effects. And this includes not only the recommendations that we have for healthy eating, which we'll look at later, but things like the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, which you may have heard about, which was first developed to lower blood pressure, and others such as the Nordic diet. And whilst these may have some differences, perhaps what's more important is that they do have a lot of things in common. And so if we look across all of these different dietary patterns that are suggested to have health benefits, we can see that generally they stress higher amounts of some of the plant-based foods you see there, like fruits and vegetables, low-fat, nuts and seeds, legumes, and also some things such as low-fat dairy and unsaturated fats as well. But they recommend limiting things like fatty processed meats, more refined grains like white bread, and also things like sugar-sweetened drinks, and also reducing our intake of salt and saturated fat as well. And so, okay, that's all well and good, but how can we really try to put that all together ourselves, day to day in terms of the meals we plan and the foods that we eat? So one way to do this is through the Eat Well guide. So this is the official healthy eating model in the UK, and it's a way of translating all of the science that we have on diet, nutrition, and health into some actionable recommendations that hopefully can help us to get the right proportions of different foods and food groups in our diet throughout the course of a day or a week to maintain good health. And we'll look into each of these different areas now a little bit into more detail. So the first one, again, I'm sure we all know this is very important, but that's fruit and vegetables. Now, we should all be aiming for at least 5 portions a day, and also thinking about variety as well. The reason being that obviously different types of fruits and vegetables have different combinations of vitamins, minerals, but they can also have different types of fiber, for example, whether it's soluble or insoluble or different types. And also important plant bioactives, so things such as polyphenols that give a lot of fruits and vegetables their color. And in terms of a portion size, that's about 80 grams. And so you can see here a few examples of what that might look like. It could be, for example, a couple of kiwis as a smaller fruit, or maybe 1 medium tomato. So this is just as a kind of guide, really, to help us to see how we can try to get this amount. And so it's also important to think as well that not just fresh, but also frozen, dried, and canned as well, if it's not in salt or with added sugar or salt, that these can all count as well towards our 5 a day. And that's quite important, I think, especially when we're busy, in terms of how we can get more fruit and veg in our diets. Now, another of the larger food groups that should make up about 1/3 of what we eat is that of the carbohydrates or starchy carbohydrate foods group. Now, carbohydrates seem to have gotten a bit of a bad press in recent years. It might be that some belief that they are, for example, maybe fattening, although in truth, carbohydrates gram for gram actually have about 4 calories per gram, which is less than half what we have in fat. But they can also be an important source of nutrients such as B vitamins, iron, calcium, folate. But it is important that we think about the quality of the carbohydrate foods we have in our diets. So aiming for fewer ones that are refined, like white bread, and thinking more about things such as whole grains and also higher fiber varieties. So things like wholemeal bread, whole wheat pasta, or things such as 50-50 breads that have a higher amount of fiber in them. So that's something that we can do to try and get our intake of fiber up, because it's something we don't eat enough of in general. And this is important for our health and can reduce the risk of a range of diseases, but this includes gut health. And there is evidence emerging now showing that actually a greater variety of different types of fiber in our diet might be good for the diversity of our gut microbiome, which is all of the bacteria that we have in our gut, which are thought to be very important for health. And just to note as well that trying to choose those that are either lower sugar or lower salt options by checking the label where we can is another good positive thing we can do on this group. Now, sugar, as we know, is something that we should aim to be having less of really in our diets in general. I mean, ideally, what's known as free sugars, which are those that are typically added to foods, but also those that are in things such as fruit juices and smoothies where the structure has been broken up. We should aim to have these not contributing more than about 5% of what we have in terms of our energy. Now, that's not a very large amount, of course, but this is something that can help in terms of avoiding excess calorie intake, which can lead to weight gain over time. So another area, though, that is a common misconception when it comes to sugar is that it can either cause or can help to feed cancer. And this is a common myth that you may have heard of. And I've got a little video here that I'm just going to play. Hopefully the sound will work okay for us. And this gives a little bit more detail on why this is a myth.
There's no good evidence that refined sugar or any other types of sugar can cause cancer. So why might people think that it does? The idea that sugar is responsible for kick-starting or fueling a cancer's growth is an oversimplification of some complicated biology. All cells in our body use sugar or glucose for energy, whether they are cancer or healthy cells. There's no evidence that following a sugar-free diet lowers the risk of getting cancer, or that it boosts the chances of surviving if you are diagnosed with cancer. But eating too much sugar in our diets can make it harder to maintain a healthy weight, and being overweight or obese does increase the risk of cancer.
Right. Okay. Also, well, thank you to my colleague Sophie there for that bit more insight on why that is a myth. So, sorry. Bear with me 1 second. I seem to have lost our place. Right, okay, sorry about that. Yes, so one final area before we move on that ties off what we mean by a healthy and sustainable diet is that of hydration. Now, it's important, of course, to stay hydrated because water is a very important in our body. It's used for a lot of different processes. And if we get dehydrated throughout the day, it can mean that we get tired, or it can cause headaches and also make it a bit harder for us to concentrate, even if we have mild dehydration. And the advice is we should aim for about 6 to 8 glasses of fluids a day. That might need, we might need some more, of course, in warmer weather or if we're doing exercise. Now, the best choice, of course, is water, because it doesn't contain any free sugars or acids that can be damaging for our teeth. But it's so important to remember that all non-alcoholic drinks can count towards this. So tea and coffee as well. Of course, this does contain caffeine, but in relatively moderate amounts, this shouldn't really be an issue in terms of its effects as a diuretic. But also the milk that we have in tea and coffee can be a good source of nutrients like calcium and B vitamins. But it's best to go for drinks that are without added sugar in general. And when we think about things like juices and smoothies, they do contain, of course, vitamins and minerals and fiber, but they can also contain, can be quite acidic, which is bad for our teeth. So it's a good idea to limit this down to 1 small glass a day. And you can find out more about healthy hydration options on the link that you see there, and the slides will be shared afterwards. Okay, and so I'd like to move on to another poll question before I talk about the next section, which is to get your opinion on what you feel is the most important factor personally when you are making decisions for yourself or perhaps for your family around different foods and beverages when you're shopping. Is it taste, price? Is it health? Or is it convenience or sustainability? Of course, there might be some overlap, but which is the most important factor, would you say, for you? Oh, I think I need to go to second. Okay, yeah. So we'll launch the poll now. Okay, right. So I'll give that just a few more seconds. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that. So very interesting to see that in general, most people, almost 2/3, say that health is an important driving factor for them. And I think that is very much the case. And a lot of course, obviously a lot of studies show that people are very interested in terms of their health when it comes to shopping. But of course, in reality, it can be difficult to balance out health with these other factors, such as taste and price and what is convenient when we are busy. So we will look at later some more ways in which we can try to do that. But one thing that might not always be very obvious that we can consider is that of portion sizes. So many of us probably don't think really much about portion size always when we eat. So we tend to eat what we have in front of us on our plate, or how much is in a packet, for example. But having a healthy, balanced diet, it's not just about the types of foods and drinks that we have, but also having the right amounts of those. And portion sizes that you can see here are from a resource that BNF developed. So these are not official recommendations, but they can be used just as a way to try to gain a bit of an idea of what an appropriate portion size is for things such as, okay, you can see there cheddar cheese, so about 2 thumb-sized pieces, for example, or using finger and thumb just to measure out, for example, things like spaghetti. Now, this is not something that you physically have to do every time, but it's just useful as a guide to try to help us to be a bit more conscious of the amounts that we eat. And you can find out more information on that link there. Okay, so now we've kind of looked at some of the different areas of what's important in terms of a healthy diet. One area that, of course, has attracted a lot of interest, and I think perhaps particularly since the start of the pandemic, is that of diet and mental health. Now, about 1 in 6 adults in England suffer from anxiety, depression, or another common mental condition. And one of the challenges with this is that some of the treatments that are available are perhaps not as effective as we'd like them to be. And so there has been a strong interest in recent years in the potential influence of diets on the risk of things such as depression. Now, There are a lot of association studies showing that people that eat a better quality diet, whether it's like a Nordic diet or particularly such as a Mediterranean style diet, that this does reduce their risk of depression or how strong the symptoms are. And recently there have been two controlled trials in Australia that have actually tried to test this in a more controlled way. And they showed in both cases that a Mediterranean diet, when people were given advice on how to follow this more closely, that it did reduce the patient's symptoms of depression. However, unfortunately, as with some other areas, it's a bit too soon to know for sure if a healthier diet can definitely treat or prevent depression. And one of the reasons for this is that when we talk about associations, it's hard to know if a healthier diet reduces the risk of depression or if people with depression eat a worse quality diet. And so while the results we have are promising, there are more studies underway to confirm how strong this link is. Now, another area in terms of diet and mental health is maintaining our health and cognitive functioning as we get older. So there is research suggesting that certain nutrients or superfoods may help to benefit our brain health in this way. So that includes nutrients like folic acid, the B vitamins and omega-3 fats as well. Also, probiotics have attracted a lot of interest, and especially in relation to what's called the gut-brain axis. Now, this is something that you might have heard about, but it's a biological pathway that is goes in both ways for the gut to communicate with the brain. And it's thought that this might be part of the reason why a healthier gut microbiome or microbiota is thought to be good for health. And of course, also supplements have attracted interest in terms of preventing the risk of things like cognitive impairment or the risk of dementia. Now, specifically, there are also superfoods such as turmeric, dark chocolate, blueberries, and these have also attracted a lot of attention in research, mainly because of their rich content of things such as polyphenols and flavonoids. But overall, it's important to say that the evidence in this area, sadly, is still a little bit inconsistent. We do have studies showing that there is good promise for things such as blueberries or dark chocolate to have a benefit, but quite often these studies are conducted in animals and they use quite high doses. And so we don't really have large-scale trials in humans to definitely know for sure if there's going to be a consistent and reliable effect. And another important point is that we don't just eat single foods or nutrients, as I mentioned before, but we eat a whole diet. And so that's why specific dietary patterns, such as the Mediterranean diet or also the DASH diet, which I mentioned earlier, have attracted attention as well as a way to potentially reduce our risk of decline as we age. And this includes in the MIND diet, which combines foods from both of those two, more brain healthy foods that you can see there, and fewer brain unhealthy foods. Now, the MIND diet has been shown to be associated to a lower risk of cognitive decline, as well as Alzheimer's disease. But what we do need again in this area is larger studies that are run for a longer amount of time, because as you can see in the picture there in the bottom center, there is a very complex relationship when it comes to diet and cognitive health. There are lots of different potential processes biologically that could underpin these beneficial effects. And so we really do kind of need to know more in this area. Okay, great. So I'd like to, before moving on to talk a little bit more about immunity, I'd like to ask your opinion first on what you think is the most important of the nutrients that you can see here in terms of supporting our immune system. Okay, I'll give that just a couple more seconds. Great, thank you. Okay, very, very interesting that while some people would We're tempted by vitamin D and vitamin C, which we, of course, do hear a lot about. Interesting to see that most people went for all of the above. And I think that's a pretty accurate reflection of what we're going to talk about now, which is that when it comes to nutrition and supporting our immunity, that our immune system is, of course, very complex. This is a network of different cells and chemicals that all work together in a coordinated way to defend our body against infection. And for this reason, there are at least 10 different vitamins and minerals that have got an identified role in supporting our immunity, and also have health claims approved for them in terms of supporting our natural immunity. And this includes the vitamins that we had just now, but also B vitamins as well, and also certain minerals such as iron, zinc, copper, and selenium. And you can see on the right there just a couple of extracts from an immunity resource that we have on our website, which I'll show you a bit more about in a moment if you'd like to know more on this subject. I'd just like to zoom in a little bit more to talk about nutrition and COVID-19 specifically. So the pandemic has, of course, focused a lot more attention on nutrition, as well as specific issues such as obesity. And you might have seen a lot of sort of stories or adverts or perhaps things online, particularly I think earlier on in the pandemic, that certain foods or nutrients or the particular supplements can help to protect against COVID-19 or to protect against more severe symptoms from COVID-19. I think it's important to stress that there's no one food or supplement that has good evidence to show that it can stop you from getting COVID-19. Well, that doesn't mean that eating an overall healthy diet cannot help to support your immune system and to support our natural response, including to vaccines as well. Now, please don't worry too much about all of the information on this slide. This is one that I thought I would just put in here just to really kind of emphasize when we look at our immunity and our immune response in terms of viruses, that the situation is very complex. And as most of you identified before, lots of different nutrients are important. So you can see here just a few examples of some of the processes that involve several different vitamins and minerals. For example, in regulation of inflammation, or the processes of actually producing antibodies and their function. And so this really does mean that overall, the best thing that we can do is to aim for a healthy and varied diet, which can hopefully give us the right balance of nutrients that all play their different role in immunity and in maintaining a healthy immune system. And on the left here, you can find this if you look on our website, nutrition.org.uk. We have produced a guide for nutrition and immunity, which gives more information. Okay, now one area that you have probably no doubt heard something about during the pandemic is that of vitamin D in relation to COVID-19. And I noticed that some people chose this as an area in terms of what they felt was most important for immunity. Now, there have been a lot of studies that have emerged showing an association between a lower level of vitamin D and a higher risk of, sorry, these slides have a mind of their own for some reason, a higher risk of COVID-19 infection or worse outcomes. Now, this evidence is very much emerging, as the pandemic, of course, has been a very rapidly evolving situation. But the evidence so far has been reviewed by independent expert bodies that advise on this area to the government. So that includes what's called the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition that advises on these issues. And they concluded that, well, there might be some benefit of vitamin D when it comes to reducing the risk of what's called acute respiratory tract infections. So that includes things such as COVID-19, but also flu and other coughs and colds. But overall, there's not enough evidence that taking vitamin D to prevent or to treat COVID-19. Now, there are some supplement trials that are underway to provide more evidence on this area. But I think it's important to stress that vitamin D at the moment can't be recommended for COVID-19. That does not mean, though, that it's not still important for the main area of health for which we have our recommendations for vitamin D, which is helping to support healthy bones and muscles. At the moment, about 1 in 5 adults in the UK has a low level of vitamin D. And our main source for this, as you might know, is through synthesis in our skin. So We can only do this, unfortunately, in the UK during the spring and summer months. And once we get through to autumn and winter, where we are at the moment, we can't make any vitamin D at all in our skin. So that means we need to rely on getting it from our diet or from supplements. Now, there are only a few foods that actually really provide us with a good source of vitamin D. So one is oily fish and also eggs as well. And there are some fortified foods as well that you can find in the supermarket. But generally speaking, it's recommended that we have a daily supplement with 10 micrograms of vitamin D. So that's micro, which is much smaller, not milli, but micrograms. And that we do this throughout the autumn and winter months in order to maintain our levels in the blood at the time when we're not able to make vitamin D naturally. Okay, and so, well, hopefully we've got a fairly good overview of what we mean by a healthy diet, and also some interesting emerging areas in terms of research that relates to a healthy diet and its potential benefits. I'd like to move on now to the section talking about what is a healthy and a sustainable diet, both together. And again, I'd like to start this with a poll about what you think are the most important things in terms of achieving a more sustainable diet. What do you think matters the most? So again, of course, you are welcome to choose all of the above if you would like, but what do you think is the most important for you as an issue when it comes to more sustainable diets? Okay, great. I'll give it another few seconds there. Okay, brilliant. Thank you all again. Really interesting to see that most people went for all of the above, which I think is very interesting. And we'll look at some of these different areas that were the other options above as well. Seems to be also interested in buying less meat, and also quite a preference as well for buying locally. So I think that's very interesting, and thank you for participating in the poll. So we're going to look at each of those different areas now around, well, meat and animal-based foods in the diet, as well as dairy, and also around the potential impact of local as well. But before we do, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about, well, why is it important? I mean, we may already know the answer for this, but why do we need to think about a diet that's sustainable as well as healthy? Well, we know that there's a need to change what's called our food system. So the way that we both produce, transport, consume, dispose of the food that we have. And we know that we need to do this both from a people perspective in terms of the negative effects of poor quality diets. So at the moment, about 1 in 5 deaths globally is linked to consuming a poor diet. And we also have a large scale problem with the prevalence of overweight and obesity. 2 billion adults globally, and about 500 million are underweight. We also have, though, the planetary perspective. So producing the food that we all need is the largest cause of global environmental change. And that includes, for example, here about anywhere from about 1/5 to just over 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions globally, the vast majority of fresh water use, and also a substantial proportion of global land use as well. Alongside this, of course, we have the issue of a growing population, which is going to reach close to 10 billion people by the middle part of this century. And we know that this will increase demand for food by more than 50%. And that includes also an increased demand for animal-based foods in developing nations as incomes rise. And the Sustainable Development Goals that are set by the United Nations, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, nutrition and also food security are considered to play a pivotal role in achieving all 17 of the UN SDGs. So this raises this difficult question, really, with all of these challenges of how can we feed a growing population while reducing malnutrition and the ill effects of our diets, at the same time as addressing the environmental effects of our food system. I think when we're doing this, it's useful to look a little bit more about, well, what do we mean exactly by healthier and more sustainable? I think sustainability is a term that we hear increasingly, of course, now, but then what it actually means, of course, can vary very much depending on who's talking about the subject. But there is a definition that's been provided by the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a part of the UN. And that's that sustainable diets include a variety of different aspects to them. I won't read all of this out, but you can see in there that it's about what's culturally acceptable, safe, healthy, what is good in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems, what's nutritionally adequate as well. And so we need to think about things not just in terms of environment, but also nutrition and health, and also other aspects as well, including what's culturally acceptable, what's equitable as well and affordable. So while this is useful as a starting point, it is quite complicated. And so how can we really put this into practice? And there's still a lot of debate around what exactly a healthier, more sustainable diet should or should not contain. And so I'd like to come on now a bit more to some of those specific areas that we touched on in the last poll before. And there are some areas of, well, what we would call perhaps myths or misconceptions around the relative importance of which areas we should really be focusing on when it comes to more sustainable diet. And I'd like to ask another poll question now before we dive into the first one of these issues, which is to ask how important you feel it is when we talk about the locality. So do you think that locally produced foods generally are more environmentally sustainable? Okay, brilliant. Thank you all again for participating then. And very interesting to see that, well, almost 2/3 say that actually they think it depends, while about a third are saying that they do think that this is the case. Now, I think that's very interesting and quite an accurate reflection of what we're going to look at now in terms of local foods and their importance. Okay, and so what you can see here on the right, you don't need to worry too much about all the detail, but if you look at the gray bars, this shows from a very large scale analysis of all the lots of different food types and their environmental impact, that there is quite a large range, particularly for some of the animal-based foods, in terms of the impact that they have in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, but then also land use, and the situation is also similar for water. Now, it's important to stress that there's a huge variation in the environmental impact of our foods, as you may well expect, depending on both where and how they are produced. And just as an example here, again, from this analysis, so this was from over 38,000 farms globally, and is considered to be one of the sort of most robust data sets that's out there in terms of environmental impact of foods. And you can see that when you compare the top 10 most impactful beef producers with the bottom 10% of least impactful producers, and there's quite a large variation. So 12 times greater greenhouse gases, 50 times greater in terms of land use. And we also need to think as well alongside this about the fact that most of the greenhouse gases from our food system, so all of the supply chain, actually occurs at what's called the pre-farm gate stage. So most of the inputs and most of the impact of the food that we consume is actually occurring before it really even enters into the processing, transport, or retail stages. So most of it's happening at the stage where the food's actually being grown or where animals are being reared. And so when we compare that across to, for example, transport and packaging, these are also very important areas and their contribution can vary. But when we look at it overall from a global perspective, they each account for about 5% of the total globally. And so thinking a lot more really about how foods are produced and where they're produced is probably likely to be more important in a lot of cases anyway, than the aspects such as transport and packaging. That doesn't mean, of course, we shouldn't be making efforts in these areas, but it's just to show you that where the overall balance of impact lies, most of it is before the food reaches us. Okay, so another area and another term that, of course, we hear about a lot, particularly we're still in Veganuary at the moment, is that of a plant-based diet. And so I'd like to ask your opinion before looking at this in more detail. What do you think is a plant-based diet? Brilliant. Thank you all again. That's really interesting to see. So it appears that we have a bit more of an even split perhaps on this one than the previous questions. So it looks as though most of us really consider that to be either vegan or maybe a vegetarian diet. And we have a smaller number of people saying that it could be more of a flexitarian style diet that has some meat, fish, dairy and eggs. That's very interesting as well, because that largely matches up with a survey, a YouGov survey that we commissioned at the British Nutrition Foundation towards the end of 2020. And this showed that, again, there appears to be a lot of potential confusion perhaps around what we mean when we say plant-based. Now, of course, there's no official definition, if you like, of this or legal definition. I think this is perhaps part of the problem. But in this survey, we found that about 61% of people thought that this meant a vegan or a vegetarian diet, and only a smaller proportion felt that it was a flexitarian style diet. Now, what's the potential reason for this? Well, obviously, the popularity of plant-based diets and, of course, products as well has increased phenomenally in recent years. Although there might be, well, confusion, disagreement, even amongst the research community and those working in food and nutrition about what exactly this term means. I think it's important to stress that within the government healthy eating advice called the Eat Well Guide, which we looked at before, and other healthy dietary patterns, things like a Mediterranean diet that's got links with beneficial effects for health as well. These are mainly plant-based in terms of the foods that they suggest. And yes, they do still include some smaller amounts of fish, meat, dairy and eggs, but more in moderation. And we also need to think as well about the fact that plant-based products are not always necessarily going to be healthier. If something is sold as plant-based or vegan, of course, it does not mean that it's not necessarily high in saturated fat or salt or sugars. And also, it might not provide important essential nutrients that we do get from animal-based equivalents. This is why, overall, it might be more helpful to think about, rather than plant-based, a diet that is more plant-rich, and in which we shift the proportion of foods that we eat to eat more foods that are plant-based, but not necessarily needing to exclude animal-based foods unless we choose to. And one way we can check on the healthiness of, for example, plant-based foods is to look at the traffic light labeling on the front of a product, which you see there in the bottom right. So this gives us information on the fat, saturates, and also sugars and salt. So if we go for more greens and ambers and fewer reds, this can help us to make healthier choices. Okay, so I'd just like to touch a little bit on what is potentially an important issue in terms of nutrition when we think about the shift towards a more plant-rich diet. So if we're restricting or perhaps eliminating animal-based foods from our diet, then that can have potentially some important effects in terms of particular nutrients. So what you can see here in the table is just a percentage for certain nutrients that we get from foods that are of animal origin. So particularly, of course, vitamin B12, but also things like iodine and selenium as well. And alongside that, we need to think about the fact that there are some differences between plant-based and animal-based sources of some of these nutrients. So when it comes to iron, we know that from plant sources, it is less bioavailable, which means it's less easily absorbed by the body. And also when it comes to vitamin D, which of course we mentioned is important before and important to think about supplementing as well at this time of year, that vitamin D3, which usually comes from sheep's wool and is therefore not strictly speaking vegan friendly, there's evidence that shows that this can be more effective in raising our vitamin D levels than D2, which is from plant-based sources. Now, there are also vegan-friendly sources of vitamin D3 out there as well now, from produced from algae, which but these are not necessarily as readily available in the supermarkets, for example. And also, when it comes to certain compounds as well that we have in particular foods, these can inhibit the amount of minerals that we are able to absorb, things like iron and zinc. So, for example, spinach contains something called oxalic acid. So this is a compound that will bind a lot of the iron that is contained naturally in spinach. And unfortunately, that means that we can't absorb it as readily as we can from animal-based sources. And lastly, iodine is one that maybe many of us don't really think about much. We don't think about in terms of a vegetarian or a vegan diet and the nutrients to be aware of. But at the moment, about a third of all of the iodine in our diets is from milk and dairy products. And some alternatives to these that do not provide iodine. So this is quite an important one to check out on the label if you do prefer milk alternatives. Okay, and so before moving on to the next area within sort of healthy and sustainable diets, I'd like to ask you another question, and that is around, this is our final question, whether or not you feel that a healthier and more sustainable diet can contain animal-based foods. So what is your opinion on this? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So it looks again like we have most people most people kind of leaning more towards a kind of flexitarian style diet, I suppose, which is that, so 88% of people saying that they feel that we can include some meat, fish, dairy, and eggs in moderation, and that's okay within our diet. Okay, thank you very much for your participation on that. It's very interesting to see. And so on that point, I'd just like to comment a little bit on vegan diets. So as Kat mentioned at the start, we did undertake a review of the evidence on healthy and sustainable diets and what the research shows, which we published in July last year. And within that, we did look at some studies that considered a vegan diet. And it definitely appears that adopting a vegan diet could definitely have large benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and also land use as well, and in reducing that compared to our current average diets. And also vegan diets, we have known for some time, are associated with potential health benefits. So that could be in reducing the risk of heart disease and some cancers. What we don't know fully within nutrition science is whether or not that might be due to the fact that vegans tend to have a lower energy intake, or if they might be healthier in other aspects of their lifestyles as well. For example, not smoking, perhaps doing more exercise, or not drinking as much alcohol. But if we think about the environmental impact, whilst a vegan diet could be beneficial in terms of greenhouse gases and land use, one area where it appears it's more difficult to achieve a reduction if we're going vegan is that it might not help to reduce the water footprint of our diets, which is another very important aspect. And it's also, at the moment, seems quite unrealistic that most people will strictly adhere to either a vegan or a vegetarian diet in the UK. There's definitely a strong interest, of course, in people reducing their meat intake, and there are surveys showing that. And of course, we also see the rising popularity of plant-based and vegan options, and of course, the interest in veganuary. But overall, from what we can see from nationally representative surveys, only about 1% of people consider themselves vegan and about 4% vegetarian. And also, as we already talked about, if we're either restricting or excluding animal-derived foods in the diet, there's some important nutrients for us to think about, such as iron, zinc, and vitamin A and B12, and also iodine. Now, some of these could be a potential cause for concern with some groups where at the moment we already have evidence where there are either low intakes of certain nutrients or there are issues with the status of these. So, for example, in the UK, almost 1 in 10 girls 11 to 18 years is thought to have iron deficiency and anemia. And so I think the important point here is that if we are trading perhaps a poorer quality omnivorous or flexitarian style diet for a poorer quality vegetarian or vegan diet, there are things that we need to think about in terms of potential nutrition concerns. And I think this also is the point where whether or not we choose a vegan diet, vegetarian, pescatarian, or a more flexitarian style diet, that it really is important that we think about the quality of our diet overall. Okay, now one area in which there has been a misconception over the years in terms of vegan diets is that they perhaps don't quite have enough protein, or that vegans need to consume more protein than meat eaters in order to get enough for their requirements. And so we're going to look a little bit more in some detail on this subject in this video. People sometimes think that those who do not eat any meat or fish will not consume enough protein. Meat and fish are rich sources of protein. However, vegans and vegetarians typically do get enough protein from their diet, and a well-planned vegetarian or vegan diet which contains a variety of plant sources of protein can also provide enough to be healthy.
Proteins are made up of substances called amino acids. Our bodies can make some of these amino acids, but others, known as essential amino acids, are needed from the diet. Consuming a range of plant protein sources will help ensure you are getting enough of all the essential amino acids in your diet.
Okay, right. So I think, again, the overall message here is around diversity. And it's important to think about trying to include a range of different protein sources in our diets. I think that goes for if we're eating a flexitarian or sort of vegetarian diet, but can be more important as well for a vegan diet. And if doing that and planning a vegan diet sufficiently well, then of course it can be healthy and can give us the right balance of nutrients that we need. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, we seem to have jumped to a different place here. Right. Okay, and so in this final part, now I think trying to build and put all of this together, hopefully, is to try to give some advice on, well, how can we try and actually eat a healthier and more sustainable diet? So we've looked at the issues, we've looked at some of the concerns, some of the myths, misconceptions in what is a very complicated and nuanced area, but what can we actually do? Now, I think it's important to stress that there's definitely no one-size-fits-all solution to such a complex problem. But there are definitely some actions that we can all take that are likely to benefit both our health and that of the planet. And this is around kind of 6 different areas which we'll look at and try to offer some practical, actionable tips for you as well. Now, the first one is to focus around the Eat Well guide. So there are other dietary patterns as well that could help us to reduce our environmental impacts and that are good in terms of nutrition. But there is a study that was out in 2020, for example, showing that if we follow the Eat Well guide, that this could deliver not only health benefits, but also environmental benefits as well. So versus our current diet in the UK, on average, this could reduce greenhouse gases by about 30%, slightly reduce water use as well, and also reduce mortality risk and have health benefits as well. Now, within this particular study, these were the different recommendations, including, well, 5 a day for fruit and veg, and also including fish in our diets as well. So 2 portions per week. One is an oily fish, and one is a non-oily fish. And also limiting red and processed meat in our diet as well. So this is only really a concern if we're eating quite a high amount. So if we're eating more than 90 grams per day, we should aim to decrease this down to less than 70. Fiber, as we already talked about, is important as well. And we should aim to get at least 30 grams per day in our diet. But at the moment, the evidence shows we're not quite reaching this target. But also things to limit as well we need to think about, such as salt and free sugars, and also saturated fats. So one potential benefit of the Eat Well guide in terms of helping us to shift towards a more sustainable way of eating is that it's a pattern that's familiar to us in the UK, and it does allow for some of these nutrient-rich animal source foods as well in moderation, but with a diet that is overall plant-rich. So we know that against those recommendations you see in the box there at the moment, we're not doing that great. So about 30% of us do manage 5 out of 9 of these, but only about 0.1% actually manage all 9 recommendations. So there's room for improvement here. And one way we can do this is through more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and also higher fiber, starchy foods in our diets. Also thinking about things such as beans and other pulses, which would help to increase our fiber intakes. And I mentioned this is important, but at the moment, fewer than 1 in 5 children and fewer than 1 in 10 adolescents and adults is actually meeting the fiber recommendation. And meeting this recommendation is linked to a lower risk of several diseases, as well as also helping to promote our gut health. Now, the second area is fruits and vegetables. So as we already looked at, eating at least 5 a day is important, and this is aiming for variety as well within that, because they all contain different combinations of vitamins and minerals and fiber. But at the moment, only about a third of UK adults and fewer than 1 in 8 adolescents is actually meeting this 5 a day minimum target. So, well, how can we do this? So there are, of course, a range of different ways that you can try to achieve this to fit with your own lifestyle. And these are just a few suggestions, which I'll make over the next few slides. Well, it could be swapping snacks, for example. Or one thing that I personally try to do in the morning is to take 2 or 3 pieces of fruit and to put them next to my computer. So, of course, as you're working throughout the morning, you feel a bit peckish, you're reaching for something that you can see in front of you there that's healthier. And it just makes it all a little bit easier to get more fruit into our diets. But also in terms of vegetables, not just fresh, but as I mentioned before, frozen and canned also count. And these can be a great, easy way to boost the vegetables in a recipe, for example. And also thinking about things like fruit on our breakfast cereal in the morning, or adding it into porridge, for example. These are all ways that we can try to work more fruit and vegetables into our diet throughout the day. Now, another very important area is to look to diversify the protein foods that we have in our diet and to try to go for more plant-based sources. So overall, we really do need to try and rebalance what we eat in favor of more plant protein sources. And this includes things such as beans and other pulses, such as lentils and peas, but also nuts and seeds as a good protein source, alongside some plant-based meat alternatives. But again, it's good to check with these on the label or on the traffic light label on the front that they're not high in saturated fat or in salt. And we can include this, of course, alongside some moderate amounts of meat, fish, and dairy and eggs. But it's important to remember it's not just about protein. The overall composition in terms of the nutrients that we get from particular foods is what matters, including essential nutrients that might be provided by animal-based foods. And that also a lot of these plant-based sources of protein can also provide us with fiber. And a couple of suggestions for how we can do this are, it could be as simple as, well, adding canned beans or chickpeas into dishes. So half, or even doing half beef for beans, or half chickpeas for chicken, for example, in a recipe. Or one of our personal favorites for a midweek salad is to open a can of chickpeas, maybe alongside some cheese or whatever else you fancy, to kind of build up a salad really around that. So that can be quite an easy and flexible way, hopefully, to get some more pulses into our diet. And we can also, of course, try other more novel plant sources like tofu or mycoprotein as well, as an alternative, either all or some of the time. Now, the fourth area is around foods that we kind of know are less healthy really in our diets, things like cakes, biscuits, pies, pastries, that we know are not the healthiest choices, but they're, obviously we also enjoy as well. But I think it's important to stress that while many of us might not think about this, these do also contribute to the greenhouse gases, but also the land and the water use as well that's linked to our diets. And so how can we try to practically reduce these? So, well, one option is to try to be more aware of portion sizes. So it might not always be easy, but we could take, for example, smaller amount of crisps and put them into a bowl. Try breaking off a few squares of a chocolate bar, putting the rest back. And also trying to plan ahead as well to make sure we've got some healthier snack options available to us. So that could be things like a small handful of unsalted nuts or seeds. Or if we're feeling peckish, it could be something like a wholemeal toast and peanut butter, for example. But also another option could be no added sugar yogurt with berries. And so these are just, again, a few suggestions, but important to highlight that it's not just about some aspects of our diet, such as perhaps meat or dairy or other food groups, but that also these less healthy ones can contribute to our impact of our diet as well. Now, another important area is around fish and seafood. So we're recommended to eat 2 portions of fish per week, about 140 grams. And one of these should be an oily fish. And that's because these contain not only vitamins and minerals, but oily fish also has beneficial long chain omega-3s. So that's things like EPA and DHA that can hopefully benefit our heart health. At the moment, though, we do have a problem potentially with this because about a third of fish stocks globally are considered to be overfished. And so that's why it's important that we get as much information as we can about where our seafood comes from and to try and choose some more sustainable options. The first way we can try and do this is with experimenting with a wider variety. In the UK, about 80% of the seafood we consume comes from the 5 species called the Big 5 that you can see there: cod, haddock, tuna, salmon, and prawns. And if we try to eat a wider variety outside of this, it can help to spread some of the pressures across farmed and caught fish, and also help us to choose some options as well where the levels of fish and the fish stocks might be in a healthier state. So we can do this through choosing eco labels also, as you can see in the bottom left. I'm sure you recognize particularly the blue MSC logo, also the ASC, which relates to aquaculture or farm seafood. But there are others as well, like the Soil Association and RSPCA. Now, the standards do vary across these different labels, as you might expect. Some focus more on the environment, like the MSC, and some are more focused on issues to do with animal welfare, or also more sort of social issues. So, for example, in the ASC, that includes consideration of things such as employment rights, for example, of people that work in fisheries. And another thing we can do is to download or to look on the website of the Marine Conservation Society for the Good Fish Guide. Now, this is something that is released and updated every year, and the Marine Conservation Society makes some recommendations for switches that we can make that are more sustainable. Or, excuse me, if we're looking at buying a particular type of fish or seafood, to maybe choose one that comes from an area where the stocks are thought to be in a healthier state. And you can find this information if you look on the label of seafood. It should be provided there where it is from. And so the final area, just to sort of draw to a close really, that I think is very, very important, is waste. Wasting less food and drink is definitely an important aspect of aiming for a healthier and more sustainable diet, particularly because we know at the moment about a third of the food that we produce is either lost in the supply chain or is wasted. And this is accounting for up to 10% of overall total greenhouse gas emissions, according to the IPCC. Now, the good news, though, in the UK is that we have made very good progress in this area. both through consumer action as well as that of industry as well. And so in recent years, as you can see in the top right, we have reduced food and drink waste by about 27%. And so the UK is the first country as well that's actually over halfway towards meeting the broader UN goal in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to halve food waste by 2030. So we're doing good in the UK on this point. However, about less than a third of UK adults actually seem to firmly recognise the link between wasting food and its effects on climate change. Now, WRAP, who you may have heard of, the Waste and Resources Action Programme, has launched a Food Waste Action Week, the first one being last year, which aims to raise awareness of this. And I'd recommend looking this up. It, I believe, is taking place in March, I think it is this year, and has lots of useful advice as well around ways that you can aim to reduce your food waste. Now, a few practical suggestions that I've highlighted here could be things as simple as using the information on food labels. So making sure to store foods properly, maybe looking out for things like resealable packaging, but also knowing the difference between and paying attention to best before versus use by dates, for example, to make sure we don't throw away food that might still be fine and might still be safe to eat. So best before, of course, means that we can still eat the food after that date. But of course, use by is when we absolutely can't eat food after that date for food safety reasons. And also planning our meals before we go shopping to make sure we try and buy what it is that we intend to, and to plan out meals for the week as well, whether that's batch cooking or knowing what you're going to eat each night of the week, can really help us to make sure we buy what we need, and so we don't reach towards the end of the week with things that we end up throwing away. And also setting our fridge correctly. Now, this might sound again quite simple, but in the UK, the average fridge temperature is above this 0 to 5 degrees range that you can see, and that of course means that foods go off more quickly. For example, in the UK, we throw away 3 million glasses of milk every day. And so one way that we can get involved in trying to make some healthy, positive choices to our lifestyle that I'm just going to mention, and would be great if you are able to support us either as an individual or together with your organization this year, is something called Healthy Eating Week. Now, this is run every year by the British Nutrition Foundation. We include free resources and activities across 5 different areas to help people to make some positive changes for a healthier lifestyle. And this year, our focus will be on eating well for you and also for the planet. So last year, we had a large number of registrations and over 1.5 million participants taking place. And you can find the link there for registering for this year. And hopefully some of you will be interested in taking part. It's always a very good, very positive week. We have a lot of social media activity. We have a lot of involvement with schools as well as workplaces. And I think it's a very nice, positive way to make some simple changes to our lifestyle that hopefully we can maintain and carry forward. Now, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for this part of the session, and that you can find out more information on a lot of the different areas that we looked at today on our website, nutrition.org.uk. Okay, and so I think we might now move on to, I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A so far, but of course, if there's anything else that anyone would like to know about, either with what we've talked about here or any other areas or issues that you're curious about in terms of diet and health, then please do post a question into the chat.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, if like Simon just said, all in the Q&A section if possible. We do have a couple of questions already while other people might be thinking about what they would like to ask. So this question says, do you think algae oil tablets are a sufficient replacement for fish? If not, how much oily fish should we eat per week?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, David. Yeah, so yeah, when we think about omega-3 fats, and especially those ones we can't produce in our body ourselves, so what's called the long chain omega-3 fats that we get from fish oil, I think it's a very good question in terms of how appropriate algae oils might be. But I think the broader issue might be really around how effective fish oils in a supplement or as a capsule actually are for our health. So there's been a lot of interest and a lot of research in this area. And there's a very large scale analysis of all of the data and all of the clinical trials that have been done in this area that was published recently. And what they found that was actually omega-3 is unlikely to have many benefits, and that the number of people who would need to be taking oily fish supplements, for example, would be very high in order to see a benefit in terms of the reducing risk of things like heart disease or a stroke. I think from an environmental perspective, though, of course, there is still a strong interest in taking oily fish. And it is being explored now much more, the potential for algae to provide this, of course, because of the pressures on our wild fish stocks as well that we've got. And so I think the important thing in terms of talking about this in replacement for fish is I think it's better to try, if we can, to try and get at least one portion of oily fish per week in our diet, as I mentioned before. And that's not just because this contains the omega-3 fats, but it also has other beneficial vitamins and minerals in there as well. And what we do have is fairly good and reliable evidence to show that increasing our fish intake is likely to have better health benefits. Whereas when it comes to omega-3, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of research in this area, but some of the biggest and most recent trials and summaries of this show that it's unlikely to have much of a benefit in terms of capsules.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Simon. And I think David also has another question relating to meat. Likewise, do you need to eat red meat for iron, and if so, how much, and what is most sustainable?
Wow, yeah, another really excellent question. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I talked about obviously the nutritional importance of foods that are animal based, but I think I wouldn't say that we need to include red meat in our diet at all. No, there is some evidence to suggest that for vegans, for example, vegans and vegetarians also, that they may have a lower intake of iron, and they might also maybe have a lower sort of iron status. I think the issue with this is that we don't have clear evidence of what this might actually mean in terms of long-term health. And so if we're concerned about iron in the diet, then obviously we can include other plant-based sources. So I mentioned, for example, pulses are a potential source of iron as well. And what we can do if we're shifting our diet towards more plant-based foods is try to include a source of vitamin C as well. So vitamin C is it can help to increase the absorption of iron from plant-based sources in the gut, and so that's one way that we can also try to increase the amount of iron that we utilize and absorb from plant sources.
Lovely, thank you. And we have a question from Kirsten, who says, how big is the recommended portion size for the 5 a day? Grams doesn't mean anything to me. Can you show me in terms of size?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Brilliant question again. Yeah, and it is quite often hard to visualize some of these things that we're told in terms of advice. So I think if I perhaps go back up here, we can see hopefully on this slide here just a few examples of what 80 grams could look like. Obviously, it depends on the size of the fruit or the vegetable. Of course, this would be something like a whole handful of grapes, whereas actually it could just be one medium apple. And so I think this is just a guide in terms of a portion size. Where this advice actually comes from for 5 a day is that it's shown that consuming 400 grams overall of fruits and vegetables is strongly associated with some benefits in terms of reducing our risk of heart disease, as well as stroke and some types of cancer. So that was really kind of where this advice for this amount of 5 portions a day and 80 grams came from. And this is the advice that we have in the UK. In other countries, this does actually differ a little bit. So for example, in Australia, I believe it's 7 portions a day that are recommended. And this is, of course, a minimum. So it's not once we've hit this target, okay, we should stop. Ideally, including more portions in our diet is something that we can do as well. But I think, again, to make that point that you see at the bottom there, that it doesn't all need to be fresh. It could be frozen, dried, canned. So it could be things such as putting a kind of sort of sweet corn into a salad or into a dish you're cooking, or kind of peas in a curry, for example. So this is all ways that we can increase the kind of the convenience, the affordability, and the opportunities, I think, really to get more fruit and veg in our diet.
Brilliant. And I think we have time for maybe just one more question. We've had one come in from email saying during Veganuary they've tried to go vegan, and but they've heard or there's like maybe a myth around tofu raising estrogen levels. They wanted to know, is that true? Is there a link? And if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think where that comes from is there's the link between foods that are soya based and what are called phytoestrogens. So they're plant compounds that basically mimic the effect of estrogen in the body. And I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest, specifically with tofu, but I know this has been looked at in terms of other soy-based foods in the diet as well. I don't think there's an overall cause for concern in terms of eating too much. I mean, it perhaps might depend if you're consuming a lot of tofu very, very regularly, but I think this is why it's important to have this message of diversity. So try to think about maybe some other plant-based sources of protein in diet, things like canned pulses, lentils, beans as well. So I don't think there's really a cause for concern there in terms of safety, but it is still a good idea to try and have a diversity in our diet.
Wonderful, that's really interesting. And well, David has one more question because he's been so good with questions. Maybe we'll just answer one more, David. He said, how much unpasteurized food do you think we should be eating a week?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Unpasteurized. Okay. So well, that is interesting. And I suppose one of the main areas for that really would be to do with unpasteurized dairy, and I don't know of any specific benefits, so I don't think there's really any sort of strong evidence to suggest that non-pasteurized foods can offer specific health benefits. They perhaps might have certain things or bioactives in there that might be degraded in the pasteurization process. But of course, it's important to remember that the pasteurization, of course, is done for the sake of food safety, but then also can help to increase the shelf life, of course, of things like milk. And I think that kind of relates back to the point on food waste. We already waste about 3 million glasses of milk a day in the UK as it is, but I don't think that there are any specific there are no specific recommendations in terms of unpasteurized foods, or specifically when it comes to dairy. And so I think it's really important to think about balance really across the different groups that we looked at in our diet, as if we are trying to improve the overall healthiness.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. A massive thank you for this really informative and eye-opening session. I think it has been for everyone. And thank you everyone who's been able to join us today. Apologies if anyone had any trouble listening to the videos. We'll make sure to send those round after the session. But do stay tuned, because we will be sending information for our February events shortly, so we hope to see you then. But thanks everyone again, and take care.